arguably the finest book ever written about a man's relationship with landscape and wildlife. Published in 1960, it tells the story of the author's life with his pet otters in the remote West Highlands of Scotland. This much is known, but what's not been told before is the account of one of the otter boys who lived with Maxwell. Now, 40 years after Gavin Maxwell's death, Terry Nutkins tells his own remarkable story. Last week, Terry told how he first came to live with Maxwell. Today, he continues this account of his bizarre and often dramatic childhood.
This is the waterfall at Sandaig, otherwise known as Kathleen, where Gavin Maxwell wrote the very famous book, Ring of Bright Water. My name is Terry Nutkins, and I'm probably known better for presenting Animal Magic and The Really Wild Show. And I grew up in London, and at a very early age, I came here to Sandaig on the northwest coast of Scotland to join Gavin and the otters. This waterfall is just an incredibly magical place. I used to have great joy in coming here and literally just lying in a pool of fast-flowing water. Not only did we swim in here, we also fished for trout in here as well. There's a couple of deep pools. But also our water supply, our water came from this burn as well and went across the field to the house. The water flows from here, from the waterfall, right the way down to form a ring of bright water around where we lived, around Sandaig House. And yes, this is Lower Sandaig, where I grew up with Gavin Maxwell and with those otters, and standing here now is just as beautiful as it was 40, 50 years ago. I came here to look after the otters. This was so different to anything I'd been used to. I was 13 years old, and Gavin employed me, but later on he became my legal guardian. And the three of us lived here. That's Jimmy Watt, Gavin Maxwell and myself, and Jimmy Watt was the other otter keeper. It was just a life of pure adventure.
Sandaig was his soul's home place, as it were.
Douglas Botting, Gavin Maxwell's biographer.
The home place of the inner man. He had no great fondness of the human race en masse, and he was very happy to get away from it to this sort of remote Shangri-La.
Why do you think Ring of Bright Water, a book about his life with otters and wildlife, was so successful?
I think it's a classic story of man and beast, as it were. But I think it was beautifully told, and therefore beautiful to read for many people. An unusual story. There are others with other species, like Elsa and the lioness and so on, that were equally successful. And set in a magical, romantic sort of Never Never Land.
In the early days, before Ring of Bright Water was published, there wasn't any money. We had a good life and we had good food, but there wasn't a lot of money around. It was only when Ring of Bright Water was written that Gavin suddenly realised that there was some money to be spent. And did he spend it? Gavin knew how to spend money. Extensions were built and the pools for the otters, the telephone came in, the electricity came in. And I feel that all this building going on and the expansion was the decline of Kathleen, the decline of Ring of Bright Water as it was depicted in the book. But also added to that, the worst thing of all I think that could have happened was the fact that the otters started biting people. The first person that Edel bit was Caroline Cranbrook, who first arranged for me to come to Kathleen.
He had the two otters then, he had Edel and Teco.
Yeah.
And it was an extraordinary house, wasn't it? The main, well, the only sitting room was rather like a sort of ship's cabin, wasn't it? It was all panelled.
Pitch pine panelled.
Had these long, low sofas, and I was told to sit very still, and Edel came in and sort of sniffed me and went all over round and round and round, and that was that. And then a few days later, I remember we went for a walk together, and Edel suddenly sank her teeth into me, and she bit me in the ankle, and it was only when I got somewhere like there,
right.
And then when I got back and took off my gumboots and looked at my socks, I saw this sort of rather neat little piece of steak, as it were, sitting on my socks, which was what Edel had taken out very neatly.
Edel, yes, bit Caroline, first of all, and it was because of that I was bitten. Quite simply, Caroline, when she left, after she'd been bitten, she gave me a jumper. 2 weeks later, I put it on, and Edel wanted to have a walk. And she was upstairs in the upper bedroom in the house. So I went up, entered the room, sat on the end of the bed, and she jumped up onto my lap, which wasn't unusual, and she started sniffing the jumper. Well, before I could do anything, she started screaming. It all happened so quickly that I started to stand up. She dropped down onto the floor, and I had Wellington boots on, and she literally tore the front out of a rubber boot. I put my hand down to get her off my foot, get her off my leg, and of course she grabbed my finger. She started pulling and crunching, and all I can remember was the crunching sound of the bones. This carried on with this loud screaming. I always remember that. And I thought to myself, I've got to get out of this room. The door was shut. And so I pinned her down to the floor with my left hand, and she still had my hand in her mouth. And I said, softly, softly, Edel, softly. And that's one of the words that Gavin used all the time. She actually calmed down and looked at me as if to think, what am I doing? And I started moving my hand out of her mouth very, very slowly. And I thought, I've got to get out, I've got to go. And I picked her up, and I threw her. And as I threw her, she literally spun round and got hold of the other finger, the middle finger, on my left hand. I didn't look, I ran. I got to the door, slammed it behind me, and within seconds of being there, she was there, raging and screaming at the door, but I was on the other side. I've never, ever felt so much pain as I did then. Both hands were just literally looked like they'd been through a mincer. But I just held them together with this towel wrapped over them and ran across to the cottage on the other side of the field to what was known as Rafe's cottage. And Rafe Payne was a good, very good close friend of Gavin's and indeed mine. And Rafe said, good God, what's happened? There wasn't really anything he could do. It was a Sunday afternoon and the ferry wasn't working. The nearest hospital was in Broadford on the Isle of Skye. I walked up and down in Gavin's room all night with the towel wrapped around my hands. Gavin was away, and by early morning I was quite exhausted, but then I had to walk up to the top of the hill and get to Upper Tor Moor. And Rafe got me into his car and took me off to Broadford Hospital on the Isle of Skye, which is where I stayed until Gavin came back. And he walked into the ward, and the first thing he could smell was gangrene. And he said, my God, we've got to get you out of here. And he did. And he took me in his 300 SL red Mercedes, a very powerful roadster, down to Glasgow, and they took my fingers off there at the hospital, and I had my arms up in stirrups, if you want, to allow the swelling to go down after they did the operation. And one of the things that I am eternally grateful for was the fact that he was genuinely concerned and unbelievably shocked by what had happened to me. Now, there's probably two reasons for that. One was the fact that his beloved otters had turned into a beast, really. And also there was me, who I guess he was fond of and close to. And he did write a letter to my father, which I've only just recently discovered.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Nutkins, I had meant to write to you a long time ago, but as you can possibly imagine, time has been short since Terry's return, and with an average of about 20 letters a day to answer, besides the double physical work, I just haven't been able to find the moment. I'm very sorry, because you had every right to expect a letter before this. Terry is very well, due I think not only to his own remarkable personality, but also, if I may say so, to the truly wonderful attitude of his parents in face of the disaster. May I say how deeply I appreciated and appreciate the way you both accepted the accident, and the way in which you both turned a real tragedy into what I believe is called an act of God. I would like to confirm what we discussed about his future. He will have a job here for so long as he wants it, and if and when he does choose to leave, we shall be very sorry. I'm forming a 7-year covenant from my own private account, by which he will receive £1,000 when he is 21. Thank you both again for all your kindness and understanding in these difficult circumstances,
and my very best wishes to you both. Yours sincerely, Gavin Maxwell. P.S. I spent the day with the Duke of Edinburgh recently. He'd heard about Terry having had an accident and sent him his personal good wishes.
Well, that was a really nice letter that Gavin had written, but of course there were many other people that were badly bitten by the otters. There were numerous occasions when our boat, the Polar Star, was grounded or hit the end of islands and got wrecked. There was Gavin's accident in the Land Rover when he crashed it and damaged his leg quite severely. And one of the last disasters, which really hit Gavin hard, was the burning down of Sandaig House. It was tragic in two ways. One, the house had gone, and secondly, I think the most tragic of all, was the fact that Edel the otter was trapped inside that house. And for Gavin to take those two whammies, those two blows in one go, was hard for him, I know. It doesn't really surprise me that the house burned down in one respect. We don't know when the wiring was replaced, really, in the whole of the house. Gavin did smoke a lot of cigarettes. It could have been that he'd left a cigarette burning somewhere. Whatever, however it happened, we will never know now. But maybe just, it could have been the curse. And what I mean by that is Gavin had a friend by the name of Kathleen who was a poet. And on one occasion when Kathleen was staying, Gavin had to go away, and she was left in charge of Midgebill the otter. Unfortunately, whilst Gavin was away, Midge went off, and Midge never came back because he was killed. And Gavin was obviously shocked and saddened by this, and he blamed it onto Kathleen Raine. Well, she could accept that, but what she couldn't accept was the fact that Gavin couldn't forgive her, and Gavin never did forgive her, and she had to live with that. And she suffered greatly from it, and so she went back one stormy night, so the story goes, and hugged the rowan tree and cursed Gavin by saying, "I hope Gavin suffers as I am suffering now."
There's no doubt that Kathleen fell helplessly, blindingly in love with Gavin, but he was totally incapable of reciprocating that love from a woman.
Sir John Lister Kay, who knew Maxwell in his later years.
And I think the huge mistake he made was that he sort of encouraged her to believe that there was some sort of spiritual union there, which was to do with the otters and the wild West Coast. And of course he did admire and respect her work as an academic, but he made two terrible mistakes. One was not understanding the depth of a woman's love for a man and how crushing that is if it can't be reciprocated. And the other was using her lines, "He has married me with a ring of bright water," for the title of his book, without acknowledging her. If you look at the original publication of Ring of Bright Water, the whole poem is quoted in the front of the book, and it is not Kathleen Raine's name at the bottom of it. There's no name at the bottom of it. So when the relationship went wrong, she threw that at him in anger.
Well, it went wrong when Midge, of course,
died. Yes.
And there was the curse of the rowan tree, John.
Yeah.
Did he ever mention that?
Yeah, he did. Yes, he did. He was by then extremely bitter against Kathleen. And I think that he chose to believe in the curse because it strengthened his position of bitterness. And he used to refer to her as that bloody witch. I mean, I personally never gave it any credence at all. I just think
No, but the important thing is that I felt that Gavin did take that all on board.
Yeah.
John, as you know, I grew up with Gavin in the early years. A very complex man to be with. Very funny and sometimes very depressing. And I sort of felt there was some kind of dark side within him. How did you feel about that?
Oh, I agree completely, Terry. There's no doubt at all that he had demons. And they were partly because of his upbringing. As you know, he had very aristocratic ancestry on both sides, the Maxwell side and on the Percy side. And it is very tempting for people born into that very exclusive circle to spend their entire lives going from great house to great house to great house, shooting, fishing, hunting, parties, you know, whatever else. And Eustace, you see, his brother, did do that. But Gavin didn't. Gavin was very much more a man of action. But I think that
that background had a very profound hold on Gavin, and I think the conflicts of being the eccentric, the man of action, the writer-explorer, with the magnetism of the social set in which he was brought up, I think did create problems for him, and they manifested themselves with depression. And I did wonder at one stage whether he was manic depressive, but I don't think he was. I don't think he was bipolar. No. I think he was simply inclined to depression when things went wrong.
Of course, with Gavin, his father died when he was just 3 months old, which, and then his mother, Lady Mary, really was quite possessive with him. I think that may have been one of the problems.
I think it had a very big impact on him, on his sexuality as well as on his personality.
It's very funny because I can't remember, I was looking upstairs because I've got a little section in my library of books by and about Gavin, and I couldn't find this book. But it's a biographer who wrote saying that at a certain point in his life that Gavin decided he needed to get married, that he needed a consort, and he was considering these two women, Lavinia Renton and Caroline Jarvis, who worked at the zoo, but he felt that he couldn't make up his mind because he felt on the whole that Lavinia would be more suitable because she had a better pedigree, I think, than I did. Which was a very odd criterion for getting married, and sort of, I think, it sort of makes a marriage doomed to failure on those grounds alone. And I did say I think this would be a colossal mistake, really.
It's a beautiful summer's day, the birds are whistling, and I've travelled down to deepest Devon. And I've travelled here for one reason, and that's to see Lavinia. And Lavinia was married to Gavin Maxwell. Now, I haven't seen her for many years, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat with her. Now, have I ever been here before?
Apparently not. I think you'd have recognised it. You'll be blind when you come in here. It's dark and cool. Yes, Terry, you will duck, won't you? Otherwise we'll have a dead Terry.
I will.
Come on, stay ducked, everybody.
All right, okay, there's little doors.
Duck, duck, duck.
Would you mind just going back to the beginning, really, with you and Gavin, and when you first met Gavin, and where was it you met him, and what attracted you to him?
Well, I'll tell you how I knew him was because Edward, my husband Edward, was in the Special Forces, and there was a big training place up the west coast of Scotland, and Gavin was working there too, so that's how they met.
So they worked together in this...
They worked together there, and they became good friends there.
Right.
And then Edward and I were sort of parted, and I was up in Scotland with the children for holiday time.
And that was nothing to do with Gavin? That was
nothing to do with Gavin.
No.
Well, yes and no. You know the family home? Monreith. And this was and what's his name was living in it, his brother.
Sir Aymer.
Sir Aymer, yes. And Aymer had this very nice house. It was a sort of dower house, and he lent it to us, me and the children. And Gavin turned up there, and he said then, if ever I marry, it could only be you. So that surprised me rather.
Really?
Yes. So that started the ball rolling, as it were. Gavin then said, will you come up to Sandaig and we'll decide then. I think that's really what it was.
OK, so you were at Sandaig and we both agreed to marry.
And we announced it. And the next thing, then the press arrived, and I remember us walking across the grass away from the house down towards the water, the sea, you see.
Yeah. And got lots of magical pictures of the young couple.
Yes, there must be some somewhere, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd be good to see
those. Them all, probably.
No, well, I don't know. So that was all announced.
And that was announced, and then decided that we got married on February the 1st, I think it was.
Right.
And then, oh, yes, a little church in Covent Garden, the Scottish sort of Protestantism, and it was something to do with... Whether it was to do with me being divorced or not, I can't remember really why we went there.
So there we are. You've had the wedding, and then you had the reception.
We come out and we get into Gavin's lovely Mercedes car, the red one, with presumably the roof down, I think. and we just drove away, but there were cameras there.
Well, I saw a photograph of it, and the roof was down, and there were loads of cameras, loads of flashes, and I mean, did you get the sensation of being a star? Were you a celebrity? Did you feel...
No, I was too busy sort of getting into the car and driving away with Gavin as Mrs. Maxwell.
Can you tell me how the relationship formed from then on?
Well, I think from his point of view, he realised that he needed space and peace, and really wanted to be on his own. You see, I have a theory, call it a medical theory, about Gavin. He had some very strange illness when he was at school, didn't he? When he was at Stowe, when he was about 15 or 16. And the impression I got was that something had interfered with his development, both mental and sexual, probably. I then, afterwards, sort of looking back, came to the conclusion that he had not matured emotionally and could not really cope with close proximity, close relationship with a grown-up person.
Do you think he had a problem forming relationships with women?
Oh yes, I do, yes. I mean, he could form relationships up to a point, but you see, with me, when it came to a sort of full marriage relationship, it was jolly tricky for him.
Right, okay. And of course that wasn't something that you expected.
I knew it would be tricky.
Did you?
Oh,
so
yes,
you knew it'd be a bit of a challenge.
Yes, but it wasn't an adult bisexuality with him. I think it was still the undeveloped boyish side of him.
Okay, yeah.
Do you agree on that one?
Well, I found him a very complex man, and I wasn't terribly old myself, and so I was in a situation where I was trying to work out this complex man in a house in the middle of nowhere.
Yes, quite, yeah.
So, yes, I found him rather odd, and that's why I always thought that he had the otters, because he would lavish all of his
affection on them. Then there was the famous occasion where, I mean, we didn't sleep in the same room.
No.
He used to sleep downstairs in his study, didn't he?
That's right, yeah.
I was upstairs in the room up above, which had the two beds. And on this particular occasion, I was on the bed next to the window, and the other bed was full of socks which I'd been darning and all those sort of things. Yeah. And how the row started, if you could call it a row, I can't remember. But obviously we'd been arguing a bit or something, and I went upstairs and I heard a gunshot, and I was absolutely furious with him to behave like that. I didn't know if he'd shot himself or what, so I rushed down and opened the door and shouted at him and said, "What the hell are you doing, you know?" He was quite drunk, sitting on the edge of the bed waving the gun about. He said, "There was a rat in the fireplace." I said, "Don't be silly, there aren't any rats in here." And I'm going back to bed. So I went back to bed, and I got into bed, and I was rather shaky like that, lying there. And I suddenly heard plonk, plonk, plonk. And up he came, up the stairs, flung open the door, and fell onto the bed next door, tipping all the socks onto the ground. And I pulled his legs onto the bed and lay him flat and covered him over and said, "Go to sleep."
And that he did? He
did, yes, yeah. Whether he remembered anything about it the next day, I don't know. I mean, you had to watch your step a great deal. I mean, the closer you got to him, and of course nobody could have been closer than me in the sense of our type of relationship, and you just had to be very careful because you never knew quite which way something was going to be taken or things. I mean, I just began to realise that he wanted me out of the way. And that there was no... I can't remember at all how the final split happened. I mean, the actual timing from, say, the wedding to the divorce, of course, it took a few months, as you know, before that came through. Yeah. But it all was within 3 years, I suppose.
Very, very quick. Well, here I am back at Sandaig, and it's a little bit uncanny being here again because it does bring back all these memories of the days when I lived here. It was an amazing place to grow up, but it wasn't always easy, and I'm not complaining about it, but it was quite difficult because it was quite claustrophobic, really. Even though we had these great, vast, open areas, the Atlantic Ocean, the mountains, I was beginning to feel, after 2 or 3 years, far more confined, and I needed to get away. There were people I met, and people came to the house and visited, and there was one person in particular who came to the house, and she was a friend of James Robertson Justice's Falconer, and he was an actor that lived up in the north-east of Scotland, and James used to spend a lot of time coming down to visit us, well, visit Gavin. But they had a friend, her name was Wendy, and she came to Sandaig, and she was just the most lovely lady. And was I attracted to her? I don't know, but she was an escape route, I think, and I went off with her. And Gavin, of course, was absolutely livid. He was, and quite probably rightly so. But, you know, he calmed down, and I went back to the house, and he, if you want, forgave me for it. But I felt then more restricted because he was laying the law down, and of course he was my legal guardian. And my relationship with Gavin then really did start to decline. We argued, I distanced myself from him, and of course I landed up leaving Camrysfina. I went south and carved my own lifestyle, if you want, in the world of animals, which was the only thing I'd ever been used to and knew about. And I met Johnny Morris, the presenter of Animal Magic, and I was invited by the producer and Johnny to do a piece about dolphins. I think they were rather intrigued and interested in the fact that I'd worked with Gavin Maxwell and lived with Gavin Maxwell and otters, and it built up from there, and in the end I co-presented Animal Magic, and it all went that way. But of course, you know, I felt I really wanted to live back in Scotland, and the opportunity arose when the BBC decided to commission a film called Ring of Bright Water and Beyond, and they asked me to be technical advisor on that programme. And of course it took me back to the west coast of Scotland, literally just a few miles from here. And whilst I was there, there was a house on the market which I thought, right, I love it, I want to live there. And this is where I've been, this is where I am now, and I now have 8 children, and they live around and about the village, and I live with Sloopy, my black Labrador, not far from Sandaig, and in a way I have my, I suppose, dare I say, my own Ring of Bright Water in a funny sort of way, because my cottage is isolated and white and on the beach and surrounded by little islands, very similar to Sandaig. So where do I go from here?
Terry Nutkins in The Ring of Bright Water was presented by Terry Nutkins, the reader was Stephen Critchlow, and the programme was produced in Birmingham by Karen Gregor. In 1969, just 1 year after Sandaig House burnt down, Gavin Maxwell died of cancer, aged 55. Brunswick is thrown into emotional turmoil.